Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your favorite libertarian, me, Jeff Charles. I've got another great conversation for you guys today. Been wanting to have this guy on forever, and we're going to kind of get a little deep when it comes to the issue of police misconduct, police brutality, whatever you want to call it. There was a major case that went under the radar. So we're going to be talking about that and just about the issue overall. But before we get into everything, you know what to do. You got to like this, you got to share this, and you got to subscribe. If you haven't already subscribed, what's wrong with you? Hit that notification bell. That way you'll be updated whenever I upload a new interview. Also, check out my Substack at Chasing Liberty. You can get that at libertychasers.com, or you can just go to Substack and search Chasing Liberty. I'm writing a lot about local government issues, liberty-minded ideas, all that important stuff. I appreciate all of your support. So definitely check that out, libertychasers.com. Now, without further ado, I'm going to bring on my guest, Mr. Billy Binion. And yes, that is his real name. Welcome to the program, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Good. So I've been wanting to have you on for a while because I don't even know how I came across your stuff, but it was like a long time ago. I see you post a lot about, not just police misconduct, but you also talk about other ways that the government abuses citizens that doesn't really get a lot of attention, like civil asset forfeiture. I also believe you wrote about that. I can't remember where she was, but the lady who had owed property taxes, right, and the government basically stole her money, all of that. And, this is all the stuff that I talk about too. So you're like a kindred spirit here. So I love seeing other people talk about this stuff because not enough people do. Before we get into everything, why don't you kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this kind of thing?
Sure. So my name is Billy Binion, like you said. It's my given name, not fake as it sounds. I'm an editor at Reason. Where I've been, I guess, since January 2019, which is insane. That's almost been 5 years. Time flies. But so basically, my origin story when it comes to writing about issues of, because you're correct, it's not just police misconduct. It's more just like government accountability generally, and how difficult that is to achieve meaningfully when people raise plausible allegations of constitutional violations on the part of the government. I stumbled across something called qualified immunity, I guess, in the summer of 2019. It was before anyone was really talking about it. And I stumbled across this court case where this sheriff's deputy in Georgia shot a 10-year-old while aiming at the family's non-threatening dog, who was not even suspected of committing a crime. They just kind of like got caught up in this mayhem while the police were looking for a fugitive. And so the government shot a 10-year-old. And because qualified immunity, which is a legal doctrine that makes it very hard to sue the government when it violates the Constitution, because there was no court precedent already on the books that said shooting someone while aiming at something else, it was something like absolutely insane. Because there was no direct precedent, which is what qualified immunity requires, the mom of that kid could not sue, despite the fact that he required care from an orthopedic surgeon at all of 10 years old. And so she was just stuck footing that bill. And I was just like so confused as to how that could be a thing. It kind of sounds like parody. I feel like a lot of the stories I write end up sounding like they border on a joke, but they're not, which is hard to digest sometimes. But I think what you said is very true, that for some reason that area is very undercovered. You hear a lot in the press generally from like the fringes of both sides, right? Like the people who are like, police are bad all the time, defund, abolish, whatever. And I don't think that represents the average Democrat by any means, actually. Sure. But like the loudest fringes get the microphone all the time. And then you have people on the right who get the microphone all the time who are just kind of like back the blue no matter what. And that also, I think, does not represent, if you look at the data, where the median American voter is on that. Like there are certain polls where like it's like 90% believe that like if a police officer misbehaves, they should be able to keep doing that. These are very common sense things. But I've just kind of tried to shine a light on stories like that. Government blatantly violating the Constitution, and victims essentially having no avenue to achieve any recourse when that happens.
And I like that you said that, because people tend to forget that the fringe voices do get the microphone. That's the
Right.
exact phrase I use. And I've talked to a lot of conservatives, especially this year, traveling across the country, especially across the South. And it's like almost everyone has a story about being abused by police, or they know someone who has. So I think this idea that most conservatives are back the blue no matter what they do, yes, there is a lot of that. There is a lot of that. But I don't think that by and large, average people are on board with that. Just like on the left, not everybody's on board with just getting rid of all police or just. I mean, I think people just want solutions, but the problem is that
Right.
these things become so politicized
Right.
that
And that's
it's almost
something I think about a
impossible.
lot. I think about that a lot too, because it's kind of, it just messes with your head when that's all you hear. And the media is a business model, right? So like they are
Mhm.
incentivized to continue to give the microphone to the most extreme voices because the most extreme voices are just objectively interesting. um, and so it sends this message that that is where like everyone on that side is, and it's just not true.
Yeah, it's nut picking. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and it's hard for people like you and I because I mean, when I see your stuff, I'm like, this guy's doing what I'm doing. I don't mind talking about some of the more sensational stories. I mean, a lot of times there's some important truth to be taken out of those, but it's like, I know I can get a lot more lucrative clicks and clout and cash if I just focus on that stuff. But it's like that in the grand scheme of things, it's not important. Like,
Right.
do you ever go through that? Like you just see that. Do you ever get frustrated that when you go, the stuff that we're talking about here doesn't get as much play
Oh,
as
absolutely.
as the Senate dress code?
I was venting to that in a text group chat I'm in right before this. I saw that one of the I don't even know which reporter it was, but Carrie Lake, the failed Arizona gubernatorial candidate, is doing like some tour of the Capitol, and so of course reporters keep stopping her and wanting to talk to her and stuff. And I think it's so useless because she's literally like she's not in office. Like she's doing like a publicity tour. She claims to hate the media. She loves them and needs them, and they also love and need her. Even though the media class claims to hate people like her, they need
Sounds like somebody else we know.
right. They need those kind of fringe conspiracists because it drives so many clicks. But it also like it's like we just didn't learn anything from Trump 2016. I'm not saying if someone is running for president, if she actually declares for the Senate, then yes, she has to get coverage. People can't just ignore someone running for a Senate seat in like a major swing state. But right now, she's just nothing. She's like, she claims to be the governor elect of Arizona, and she's just like a banana, like cuckoo person, and people engage with her because it's a symbiotic relationship and an unhealthy one.
Yeah, it
But
really is,
it's
and
the epitome of what you said of like this doesn't matter. Like who,
yeah.
what?
So let's get to the Tony Timpa case, and I'll give it like a really thumbnail version of it for those who haven't heard of it. But Tony Timpa, and if I get anything wrong, you can jump in and
Sure.
correct me. But this took place in 2016 in Dallas, Texas, and Tony Timpa was having an episode, and I guess he was kind of running around, and then he called 911, and I think some other people called 911 too. He had been off his medication. He was dealing with anxiety, schizophrenia, and the officers arrive on the scene, and it was like within 15 minutes he had lost his life. They use a restraint technique that is very similar to what was used on George Floyd. They kneeled either on his back or on his neck. I've heard both. I'm not sure which,
His back.
or his, it was his back. Okay. So that, yeah, they kneeled on it for about 14, 15 minutes, and he lost his life. And the officers were just put on civil trial that just concluded last week. So again, this was in 2016, and it took 7 years to get to this point. So I kind of want to talk about that part because you covered this case, you covered the trial, and you were one of the few people who was doing it. I know Dallas Morning News did, and when it concluded, I saw some other reports. But other than that, I mean, I wrote about it a few times. But you know, can you kind of walk us through some of the roadblocks that were put in place for the family of Tony Timpa trying to get this lawsuit to happen?
Right. So it took 7 years so he died August 10th, 2016, and the trial started September 8th or September 18th, something like that. But 7 years and a month, which is insane. But so the first roadblock is that they wouldn't tell his mother what happened. The police told her a bunch of stories, like that he'd had a heart attack at a bar, that they'd found him collapsed by his vehicle. None of these were true, obviously. And so she asked for the body camera footage, but they wouldn't release it. Despite that we're taxpayers here. And it took a 3-year court battle just to get them to release the footage. So the footage comes out in August 2019. And that is the first time that she can actually plausibly file a lawsuit, because before you can file a suit in federal court, you have to state what's called a plausible pleading standard, which means that you have to know enough details about what happened, but without the body camera footage, despite that the Dallas police department knew what happened, she didn't know what happened. His mom didn't know what happened, so she couldn't state a plausible pleading standard. So then 3 years go by, she can finally file that suit. Then she has to overcome qualified immunity, which takes years because you have to argue it in the district court. So she argued it in the federal district court for the Northern District of Texas. The judge, gave them qualified immunity, which meant she couldn't sue them. So then she appealed to the Fifth Circuit. They overturned. And then the government appealed to the Supreme Court. So it wasn't until May of 2022, almost 6 years after this whole thing happened, that she even knew that they could set a trial date. So they set a trial date for July 2023. It gets postponed because the judge was upset about media coverage. And so it just happened like last week.
Okay. And you actually attended the trial, right?
Every day.
Give us an idea of your thoughts, just going through that process from start to finish. Like, what were some of the things that stood out to you the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my big takeaway was that I know that there is no panacea for any policy problem, but the right to be able to state your case before a jury, I think it sounds so basic, but it is so difficult for alleged victims of government misconduct to even get to that point. And the reason I think it's so important is that not only do I think, people who are alleging constitutional violations deserve to be heard, but also juries are fact-finding tools, right? So I even went in thinking one thing, and I felt like they were able to get a lot out into the open that you can't get in just a court filing. So a lot of details about Tony Timpa's health, for instance. He was not in good health the night he had that interaction with police. I'm certainly not excusing any of the behavior.
Sure.
For people who are familiar with this case, while he was on the grounds, officers behind him were making fun of, acting like he was a schoolboy, making jokes about Tutti Frutti waffles and getting him new shoes and how 5 more minutes. I mean, just really gross stuff. So I'm not even going to begin to defend anything like that. But I think it's so easy when you're just reading a court filing to assume, kind of build a picture of someone as a caricature. And I felt like I learned a lot more about what actually happened that night, different policies that Dallas police puts in place, and why they do. There was a lot of debate over the prone restraint. Generally, I felt like the prone restraint, which is when you're lying face down, George Floyd, for instance, I felt like that was on trial. There's very much disagreement over is it acceptable, is it not, and in what circumstances, if it is acceptable, what are those circumstances? And I just think there is something uniquely important about, for instance, those officers that were making fun of him while he was dying. There's something very, I think, important about having to watch them explain to the taxpayers who pay their salaries why they were making jokes about him while he died. That sort of thing. It sounds, I don't know, maybe it sounds really basic, but even if they hadn't gotten a settlement, they ended up getting $1 million awarded to his son. But even if they hadn't gotten anything, I think that is a form of accountability, if that makes sense. The fact that they had to get on a stand, and when you're in a trial, criminal or civil, you're supposed to address the jury. So the either defense or plaintiff's attorneys ask you a question and then you answer to the jury. And it was very interesting to sit there and watch them essentially tell the jury why they did those things and what was going through their head. And I think that's the point of a form of accountability that we have all but eliminated. I mean, I'm not even talking about criminally, but in civil trials, like I said, it's just extremely difficult to even get a jury trial. Overcoming qualified immunity does not mean you get some judgment. They could have still awarded the Timpa family nothing. But I think that people lose faith in their government if they allege plausibly that their rights have been violated, and there's legitimately nothing that can be done
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. And it goes to the saying that, the laws that we have are really set up to protect our powerful people. They're
Right.
set up to protect government officials. I mean, I was just on a space a few days ago talking about the Jamal Bowman thing.
Right.
And
Fire
yeah,
alarm.
right. But the reality I want to bring out is like, if the Constitution says that he can't be arrested while he's on his way to Congress to engage in a House vote or whatever, then yeah, that's just another example of how even our Constitution is set up to benefit the powerful. And people miss that because they're caught up in, oh, he pulled the fire alarm. Well, no, what does that say about our society? I think a lot of people don't really even understand qualified immunity, but they
Right.
don't understand how difficult it is to break that barrier. Like you said, it can be something common sense, like you don't shoot a kid, you don't shoot a
Right.
dog that's not threatening you, and then not go to jail if you shoot a kid instead. But since that's not actually laid out in the law, they just say, "Hey, cops, don't shoot kids."
Right.
Then they
Right.
can get off because of qualified immunity.
Right.
But now I think in this case, I think two of the officers did get protected by qualified immunity, right?
Right. So the Fifth Circuit is very unique in this way. Usually, qualified immunity just applies before a trial. The federal courts will evaluate if a government official, state or local, is entitled to qualified immunity, and if they are, then they're immune from having to go to trial. And so, qualified immunity is the doctrine we're talking about, where if the plaintiff, the one alleging the constitutional violation, can't find a prior court precedent that essentially already ruled unconstitutional the misconduct they're alleging near exactly. I mean, which is just hard to find. Like, there aren't that many court precedents that are going to be at, like, I'll give you another example just because it's legalistic and sometimes confusing to follow. The second qualified immunity case I ever covered, 4.5 years ago or so, was about these police officers in Fresno who were alleged to have stolen $225,000 during a search warrant. And because there was no court precedent that said stealing under those exact circumstances under a search warrant is unconstitutional, they got qualified immunity and the victims couldn't sue, which is just insane. I mean, like the quote from the Ninth Circuit, this was in California. Pardon me, it was in California. So the quote from the Ninth Circuit said something like, well, the officer should have known that stealing is morally wrong. And it's like, that just sounds like a joke, but like, it's not a joke. And the victims were left with nothing. But the Fifth Circuit is unique in that the jury can also consider qualified immunity. So after the trial, they were given a charge sheet, which is where they answer a series of questions. So question number one was Officer Dustin Dillard, who was that officer who was kneeling on him, did he violate Tony Timpa's constitutional rights? They answered yes. The second question were those officers who were standing around failing to intervene, did they violate his constitutional rights? They said yes, with the exception of one guy who wasn't on the scene really for much of it all, and I don't really understand why he was in the suit at all. And
Mansell.
Right, I didn't even mention my coverage because, to be honest, I thought it was unfair to him that he was named in the suit, and to be candid, a strategic blunder on the part of the plaintiffs because he wasn't there and did what he could when he was. So, I mean, all that to say. So now we're down to three officers who violated his constitutional rights: the officer who was kneeling on him and the two who were joking about getting ready for school as he's dying. Then the third question: are they entitled to qualified immunity? The officer who was kneeling on him, yes. One of the officers who was joking about him, yes. The other officer who was joking about him, no. And the discrepancy, they said in a press conference, was because that officer was higher ranked. And also in this trial, they brought up other examples of misconduct on his part, like he had filed a false police report, and that allegation was sustained. So then they're down to one officer who's not entitled to qualified immunity, and then based on that, they ended up awarding Tony Timpa's son $1 million.
So even though they had qualified immunity, then how did they get the settlement? Was that something that the city was supposed to pay, or were they trying to get the city and the officers individually?
So out of the 4 officers that were brought to trial, 1 was vindicated entirely. He was found to have not violated anyone's constitutional rights. Qualified immunity is a 2-pronged equation. You say, were the constitutional rights violated? And then the qualified immunity portion is, would a reasonable officer know that he was violating someone's rights? So qualified immunity, you can still have been found to have broken the law, and that's what they found with those 3 officers. You violated the Constitution, but 2 out of the 3, a reasonable officer wouldn't have known that that was against the law. So the settlement, or the damages rather, comes from that 1 officer who violated the law and who they said reasonably should have known he was violating the law. What's interesting, though, is that the 2 jurors did a press conference after, and they said that the jury overall was swayed very heavily because they thought that whatever damages they awarded would come out of the officers' pockets, which is just kind of represents a fundamental misunderstanding about how this works. I don't blame them, because I don't expect people to be in the weeds about how civil trials work and
No, they're supposed to
government
explain
federal
that
civil
to them,
office.
right?
It's
Yeah.
right. Well, no, I mean, sometimes you're not allowed to mention those things, and oftentimes defense counsel will kind of like in their arguments make it seem like, if you award damages and you'll ruin these people or whatever. To be fair, I don't feel like the defense counsel in this case did that, but a lot of times you're not supposed to go into those it's similar to in criminal trials where juries will consider criminal charges, but they're not allowed to know the punishments associated with them. So you'll see sometimes in criminal trials, juries will come back and be like, what? When they hear the sentence, like they're totally appalled. They had no idea that that was what they were considering. And it's similar to this, whether they're not allowed. I'm not fully aware of if they weren't allowed to mention it, or if it's just kind of this gray area, but they went into jury deliberations thinking that it was going to come out of these people's pockets and they were going to be ruined financially. Dallas cops are indemnified, meaning the city pays, which is true 99.98, literally 99.98% of the time. In police settlements, a researcher named Joanna Schwartz has compiled that data. She's arguably kind of like the leading expert on this topic. And I mean, essentially all cities and counties indemnify their employees from these sorts of suits. So the taxpayer pays. It's
so even in
that
cases
vein
where qualified immunity doesn't apply, they're still
Correct.
indemnified.
Right. So it's not going to come. There are some places that have tried to kind of like strike a balance. So for instance, Colorado got rid of qualified immunity for state suits. I mean, qualified immunity applies to federal suits because that's how you file a civil rights suit through the federal government. And so because qualified immunity isn't going away, Colorado said, okay, we'll try to give you recourse in the Colorado courts. And so they've tried to kind of strike a balance where any settlements an officer pays like a small portion. But in general, and it's not just police officers, it's just state or local government employees are indemnified from these types of suits. So it's, to me, my writing on this over the years, I've tried to make it less about accountability, because it's, at the end of the day, it's not really about accountability. It's about recourse for victims who have their civil rights violated. And I think that's important.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of sad. I mean, yes, it definitely is about recompense for the victims. They deserve that. But it just, to me, it's like if officers, if basically the situation is, if an officer is not going to get charged criminally, he's good. I mean, because even if he gets found guilty civilly, I mean, he's not going to be held accountable.
And to that point, and this was kind of infuriating, but when the verdict came down, the defense was very happy about it. And I mean, I understand if you were one of the officers who got qualified immunity. I especially understand if you were the officer who got vindicated entirely, who, like I said, I don't think should have ever been sued in the first place. But they got into the elevator and cheered. And and that includes the officer who was found to have cost the city $1 million. Like, he was just beaming from ear to ear. And I mean, I'm sorry, like, costing taxpayers $1 million is not nothing. That's to me, that's something. But to your point, because he knows it won't really affect him, he was just like, it was overall a good outcome for that group of people. And I think they felt vindicated. But even if they had awarded, a $40 million settlement, their lives would have gone on.
Yeah, it wouldn't have changed at all. I mean, they probably would have even still been employed. I mean, like I said, if they're not charged criminally, the worst that's going to happen is that they might get fired, go to a different county, start working again.
Right.
So, I mean, it's really, this just further illustrates just how broken our system is. Because I was thinking, I mean, I had read up on qualified immunity, but I had believed that if it doesn't apply, then officers could be sued
Right.
personally.
And
They
I mean,
can't.
obviously,
Or, I mean,
you
they
are
can be, but they're not going to
right,
pay.
right, and you're in good company with that, obviously, because this jury made their decision with that in mind. And like I said, I don't blame them because you don't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a jury of 8 people in Dallas. They're just plucked out. Um, just everyday people who aren't like ingrained in the legal system. There are like 3 people in the press who talk about this. It's basically me. Joanna Schwartz talks about it, but she's a professor. It's like, it's apart from the spike in intention qualified immunity got after the George Floyd protests, and it actually seemed like people might do something about it. In general, it just isn't something that people are interested in talking about that much, which I don't
Mhm.
fully understand why, but that seems to be the case. And it seems to be something that, people at like think tanks are interested in, but like, I mean, who's reading think tanks every day? So I don't
Yeah,
expect
no,
these jurors to
we
know that.
are.
Right, exactly.
It's our
So it's
job.
like it's a small cohort of people who are interested in these issues, like you and me and a few others, but it's kind of sad to think about because I don't claim to know what the right verdict was. Like I said, there were a lot of details introduced at trial where I actually could empathize with at least the officer applying this restraint. Like I do think he thought what he was doing was right, and I
Mhm.
was able to see past kind of this caricature that we can come to create from people if you just like look at a court filing. So I'm not saying I understand like the exact right verdict that they should have arrived at, but it is kind of tragic to me that that the verdict they did arrive at was influenced by wrong information.
So I wanted to ask you about that because, I mean, that seems like an issue to me. And I've seen other cases like this too, where the jury may have come to a conclusion because they just weren't educated enough. And
Right.
you would think that, like in some cases that the judge would say, okay, this is how qualified immunity works, yada, yada, yada. No, they just take them off the street who don't know anything about this stuff because nobody does. And they
Yeah.
expect this jury of their peers to be able to make informed decisions about somebody's life,
Right.
but they don't even have the legal knowledge necessary. I'm not saying that they had to all have gone to law school, but can you at least give them a primer before you start the case and
Right.
let them know how these things work? Let people know how qualified immunity works?
Oh, I totally agree. And that's why the Fifth Circuit, like I said, is the only federal circuit that allows the jury to even consider if qualified immunity applies at trial. And it's kind of ridiculous because the way that qualified immunity works in the federal courts, and I'm trying to make this interesting because I know it can be like legalistic and hard to follow, but we've talked about how qualified immunity works where judges have to analyze past court precedents. Juries don't know case law. So that
Yeah.
means that they were deciding qualified immunity literally based on vibes. And
Mm.
I don't like I just think it's too much to ask of people. So they get to that third question, they've decided that 3 of the officers violated the Constitution, and then that qualified immunity question, because they don't know case law, they basically have to sit back and say, okay, would a reasonable officer have known that this was a violation of the Constitution? And they just have to basically be like, yes or no. There's no objective really way to evaluate that.
Yeah.
um they're obviously not going to give them like a pile of court precedents and be like, look at these past court decisions. And also, like, that in and of itself is a silly benchmark because police officers aren't reading case law either. So the idea that previous court precedents are putting them on notice of unconstitutional conduct has never made sense, because
Mm-hmm.
they can violate their own training and still get qualified immunity, as if they're more likely to read case law than their own training. That doesn't make sense. The doctrine of this, no matter how you feel about police, no matter how you feel about government giving out damages to alleged victims of misconduct, I just feel like qualified immunity in and of itself, it's just such a nonsensical doctrine. It's not based on
It
whether
is.
something was made in good or bad faith. That was the first iteration of qualified immunity from the 60s. The one that was in the 80s, enshrined in the 80s from the Supreme Court that we have now, is whether it was clearly established in the law, which is like I said, requiring these plaintiffs to find these court precedents that oftentimes don't exist. And of course they wouldn't exist, because
Mm-hmm.
identical claims of misconduct is very rare that you'd have something that follows that closely.
Like it never
Um,
happens. Yeah.
right. And so then you have people who have meritorious claims, and maybe at trial they might seem less meritorious, but like in a court filing, as the facts are stated, this person has a plausible allegation of misconduct, and they're just not going to be allowed to state their case. I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous in that way.
Okay. So I mean, okay. I mean, because there's so much here. I want to talk about the media political ramifications of this. And the reason why is because, if we're going to solve these problems, then we need to understand them better, and
Right.
more people need to be talking about this. Now, I'm glad that I heard about this case, but I don't like the reason why I heard it. And you probably already know where I'm going with this. The only reason Tony
I'm
Timpa's
curious.
case, the only reason, and if you disagree, definitely let me know. I'm willing to be wrong. The only reason anybody knew about this case is because there are people on the right using that as a counterpoint to what happened to George Floyd,
Yes, I
to
so
point out the
agree.
media is
Right.
yeah, to point out how the media is so hypocritical, which it is. They're right. But at the same time, the people bring it up like, well, you don't care about Tony Timpa either. You're just using him as a weapon.
Right.
So,
And that
but to me,
became
it
so
highlights
clear
enough.
to me at the trial because there were
Yeah.
two of us that
Mm-hmm.
attended. And I know it's expensive for organizations to send people, but like, if George Floyd had a civil suit that media outlets would have been, they ended up settling,
Of
understandably.
course.
um, but media outlets would have been around the corner, and there were no liberal outlets, but there were also no conservative one. I mean, Reason's Libertarian in Dallas is just Morning News is a local straight down the middle paper. I mean, of course they
Mm-hmm.
probably have biases too, but they don't have
Of
like a
course.
bent. But like Matt Walsh wasn't there. If he really cares about this, and he never wrote about it, he never like piggybacked off of anyone's coverage. He never talked about
Mm-hmm.
it. But you're right. He used it as a gotcha. Ben
Yeah, and the thing
Shapiro,
is,
those types of people.
yeah, and it's not even so much that what they were saying was wrong, because yeah, it's true.
Right.
They didn't blow this up because Tony Temple was white.
Right.
That's the only reason. But to me, it's just like, okay, I could take that seriously if I knew you actually cared about Tony Timpa's case. No, by and large, or at least like you said earlier, the loud ones on the right are basically okay with this stuff happening,
Right.
and people on the left are okay with it happening as long as it's not a black person. Now, to be fair, there are some people who are consistent. I mean, like
Right.
Black Lives Matter marched for Daniel Shaver. They met with
Right.
Ryan Whitaker's
And you
family.
have
And
activists like Josie Duffy Rice, like those people who are like who both you and I probably disagree with on many things politically, but are very principled. But you're right when it
mhm.
comes to like kind of like the non-activist class. They don't if it doesn't, it really does suck. But if the victim doesn't kind of like check off a certain box, it's just not going to get as much traction.
So I have a theory that I'm going to run by you about why this happens. So police brutality and misconduct affects people of all races and ethnicities. It
Sure.
does disproportionately happen more to black people. That's true, but it happens to white people a lot. Yet the media only focuses on when it happens to a black person. Here's why I think that is. I think because if America thinks that this only happens to a small group of people in certain neighborhoods or whatever, they're not going to want to really do anything about it. There's not going to be a huge outcry. Or if there is, it might be take a George Floyd. People will march, people will riot for a year or so. Then it goes back to normal. But if the media started highlighting more of these cases, like Tony Timpa's, Ryan Whitaker's, along with the George Floyd's, Walter Scott's, Eric Garner, more
Right.
Hispanic victims, more Asian victims, and people really see how often this happens, whether it's a case where somebody dies or is just abused and they still live through it, because that happens
Right.
even more. If more people understood how deep this problem is, it might actually prompt action, which means that the media doesn't have as many stories to
Right.
exploit. Now let me
Right.
take off my tinfoil hat and see what you think of that.
Well, you said one thing that I actually do think about a lot, and that I always try to emphasize whenever I do something like this, is that it is objectively true that there is not an epidemic of like police violence against people of any race. But for one, when it does happen, it's still bad, and we still need to make sure
Mhm.
that those people, if they allege plausible claims of a constitutional violation, that they can pursue those. But there is more to police misconduct than just like killing someone. I mean, like there are
Thank you. I've been saying
right,
that for ages. Yes.
right, the property rights violations. I followed one guy's case for years where this like SWAT team, um, just like spontaneously they like got to the place they were supposed to raid, and they were just like, we're not sure which one, so we'll just pick this house, like as crazy
Mhm.
and stupid as that sounds. um the cases I talked about before, stealing, shooting a kid in the
Yeah.
leg who's lying on the ground. I mean, like these are the cases that don't make headlines because I guess they're just not really salacious enough, or people don't think they're salacious enough. But it's been my goal as a journalist to try to help people understand without
Mhm.
distorting the data, because I do think a lot of media outlets distort the data to kind of like create this idea of like an epidemic of people walking around and being gunned down by police. That's simply not true. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways in which they violate their kind of abuse their power. And I don't know why,
Yeah.
especially people on the right, are surprised by that, because I grew up in a very conservative family. I'm obviously not conservative anymore. I come from this weird politically homeless bent that you are probably
Mhm.
very similar to. So I have a weird mix of views, but kind of tied together by the idea that government is run by fallible human people who are often like really shady. And I don't understand why that wouldn't apply to the most powerful people in government, which isn't just police, but just law enforcement generally, prosecutors, that
Right.
kind of thing. There's arguably no more powerful government official than a prosecutor. And
Yeah.
we just like people on the right just like worship these people. And it's like, what are you talking about?
Until
The
they go after
entire
Trump.
ETH? Right, right, right. Exactly. But like that was actually one thing when like his indictment from I think that the indictments at this point are of varying strengths. I think the one in Florida is probably a slam dunk. I think the one in New York was clowny.
Yeah.
Alvin Bragg's indictment, and that was the first one. Um,
Mhm.
and I remember saying something like, you all are right that this indictment is like really sketchy, but like I'm asking you to consider that this happens, but you just don't hear those people's names. So like I
Mhm.
get the ire towards progressive prosecutors who like don't want to prosecute certain gun crimes, or like, we can have a debate about how to prosecute gun crimes. Feel strongly about that myself, but I understand that those people on the prosecutors on the far left are very polarizing, but like it gets back to what we are saying before about like people on the fringes. It's not that black or white. Like prosecutors of all stripes abuse their power, and like
Yeah.
law enforcement of all government officials abuse their power. We give them a lot of power. There is no accountability. There's no check on them, and that's why I think I have cared so much about finding these stories, because not only are they not reported on very much, but it is really hard, like I said, for people to trust their government if the most powerful people, there's essentially no check on them because
Yeah.
they've like written loopholes to avoid those things.
Well, and conservatives especially should be the most suspicious, but it just seems like that's that one area of government that they just trust implicitly. And and I try to do it in a way where I'm not saying, all cops are bad, but yeah, I'm going to highlight the nasty things they do, just like I highlight the nasty things the FBI does, the NSA, and whatever I see.
Right.
I mean, and it's like you said earlier, these cases don't get a lot of attention because they're not as salacious, but it's like, to me, they are. You're familiar with Joshua Rohr in Gastonia, North Carolina, right?
Oh yeah, I've written about his case for a long time.
Me too. So when I talked to him and he told me his story, I hadn't even watched the footage yet because I didn't want to. I wanted to talk to him first. And I just found myself getting so angry. And if you know me, I don't get angry very often. I just don't. I'm pretty laid back. But when I hear these stories, I'm like, how could people not care about this? Like, I know mostly it's because they don't know, but it's like, why wouldn't other journalists really want to push this stuff to the forefront?
Oh, I totally agree. And also like I find that writing about legal issues generally is interesting because the stories are about people. They're driven
Mhm.
by, policy can be hard to make interesting because I think people are
Yeah.
bored by policy. And we are talking about some topics that are kind of like in the weeds, but at the center of all of these stories is an injustice and person or people. And I think that is easier to connect with. And so I in that way, I do kind of like, for instance, you mentioned the woman whose case I covered in Minnesota, who she was, in her it's insane, in her mid 90s, and
Yeah.
fell behind on some property tax, and so the government seized her condo, and sold it and kept the profit. And for
Mm.
essentially a year, I was the only one writing about that story. And every time I posted about it, it would absolutely blow up because naturally people were just like, "How is this possible?"
Hmm.
And I was just so baffled by, I'm not trying to be like, cast myself some sort of hero for covering that story. I think it deserved to be covered. I was more so just confused why like no one else in the national press, like to me, if I were a reporter at the New York Times, I would have been all over that story. I would
Yeah.
have wanted, it's not only a very compelling personal narrative, but it was like a policy that many states across this country before the Supreme Court ultimately heard the case, like there were many victims like her, and that to me is just like a gold mine. Like a journalist should want to expose those sorts of things. I don't fully understand why sometimes they fall under the radar.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand it too, because to me, people do like hearing about those stories. They don't like what's happening. But I mean, when I wrote about Joshua, or I've written about a guy
Right.
in Arkansas. I don't know if I showed you that story, but I mean, the guy, the police, local police, my girlfriend's working on that case. But I mean, they local police basically came and stole all of his animals and accused him of cockfighting and dogfighting when he wasn't doing any of those things.
Right.
And I wrote about that. And I look at the comments sometimes. I know you're not supposed to, but sometimes I look at the
You're
comments.
definitely not supposed to.
Yeah. Well, when it concerns like original stories like that I actually worked on, then I want to see what people think. And the comments were like, "Thank you for covering this," or "I had no idea this was going on." I think that people want to hear these stories, but I think that in the mind of people like us who have different goals, I think they believe that this won't get. They don't think it's sexy enough. They don't think
I
it
think
will
that's exactly
appeal.
what it is. I think it's
Yeah,
exactly
but
what
I
it
think
is.
they're
I think
wrong, but I think that's what they think.
right, and I think that's exactly what it is. And I was on Cook's podcast after that the Geraldine Tyler thing blew up. Charles Cook at the National Review, and he asked me the same question. He was like, "I'd never heard of this until I saw your tweet thread. I have no idea why I haven't heard of this. It seems so
Mm,
outrageous." And my answer to him, I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer, but I think it's a mix of policy and legal issues overwhelm and or bore people, and then like the bore people takes it to what you just said, where I think some journalists are like, well, and therefore it is not sexy, so let us talk about Carrie
mm.
Lake and drama on Capitol Hill and what some female senator was wearing and things like that. I mean, it's just like the useless stuff that like doesn't actually matter objectively.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. I mean, and with my platform that I've been trying to build, I've been trying to build an audience that cares more about this stuff. So, but it's like funny because I can, and this is just me venting a little bit, but it's like I can do a thread on somebody like Joshua Rohr, and it'll get shared. People will share it.
Right.
But then I can make up a story with Cory Booker wearing booty pants at the Capitol, and that'll go viral. And I get it. I mean, it was funny. People liked it, but at the same time, it's like, okay, go ahead and laugh at this stuff because we have
Right.
to laugh at our politicians.
Right. So you don't cry. You have to
But
laugh so you don't cry.
exactly.
That's how I
But
feel.
like, yeah, but I would rather the important stories get shared more than that, and they don't. I mean, and it's I don't know if it's like a chicken or the egg thing. Is it because we incentivize that as consumers, or is it because we're just being fed and told where our opinion should be, or is it both? It's crazy.
Yeah. It might be a little bit of all that.
Yeah. So I did want to ask because I want to respect your time, but with the Tony Timpa case, what patterns have you observed that showed up in the Tony Timpa case that you've seen in others? Were there any kind of similarities or parallels?
Interesting. So the very famous pulmonologist who testified at the George Floyd trial, his name I think is, I do not want to
Martin
bungle this, but I think Martin Tobin. Yeah,
Martin
he
Tobin,
had a
that's
full
it. Yeah.
he had a full day of testimony, and I mean it was very in the weeds, very long, um, and so essentially what it came down to, and what I do think was interesting about this case, that in the sense that it made me think about some of the debates we kind of have on a surface level in the press that like probably need more nuance, are the issues of the prone restraint, which like some people would really stand by as not dangerous at all, um,
Hmm.
and then Martin Tobin's testimony, which is that Tony Timpa suffocated to death as opposed to had a sudden cardiac arrest. To be
Mm.
frank, I was not sure I bought that. um,
Mm.
it's hard. These things are hard, and I'm certainly not a doctor. So when you're sitting in,
It's the
obviously
other tough
people in the
part.
jury, I don't think are doctors either. So you're sitting there and you have to try to just make the best um, judgment based on the evidence before you. But like we had doctors coming in and were saying like this was definitely a sudden cardiac death. cardiac death caused by having cocaine in his system and struggling against the restraint and the stress associated with being placed on the ground. And then you have this very world-renowned, basically the pulmonologist saying, no, he definitely suffocated to death. So I think that is another kind of broader debate that will probably keep coming up in these cases if, we see more prone restraint drama in the coming years. And the science on it is just very unsettled. So, basically both sides could pick. The plaintiffs, for instance, cited a report from 1995 about the risk of sudden positional asphyxia, which is when you suffocate as a result of the prone restraint. And then on the other side, the defense was presenting studies that were like, actually, they called one guy to testify, and I was like, okay, this is a little much. But he was like, the prone restraint is good, actually, for breathing. And I was like, okay, we're really like, we really do not agree.
You want me to kneel on your back for 15 minutes? I mean, whether it's
that was when I was
whether
like,
it's fatal or not, you don't want me to do that. It's not
right.
going to help you breathe better.
Yeah, I could believe that the science is very unsettled when it comes to like, do you actually suffocate? But he was like, yeah, so actually, like, when you turn over, it's like easier to breathe. And I was like, okay, honey, like, I'm not sure this is, I don't know if this was the right move for the defense. But yeah, I think those two things, like, they weren't, I don't think, allowed to mention George Floyd during the trial, but it did feel like we were litigating some of those issues from Derek Chauvin's criminal trial, where, like I said, Martin Tobin also testified and was kind of like the star scientific witness there. So I guess we'll see.
Yeah, so last question. When it comes to the issue of police misconduct, and like you said, it's not just fatal shootings. It's a lot of things: stealing money, stealing drugs, planting evidence. I mean, there's a lot of corruption. But then with qualified immunity, and I'm a little mad at you because you kind of black-pilled me a bit, because I thought that if qualified immunity didn't apply, that meant that the police officers might have to pay out of pocket, and they don't. So they face no accountability either way if there's no criminal charges. Do you see a pathway towards dealing with the issue of police misconduct, given all the protection they have?
Yeah, I think a big part of it, actually, that should be a bigger part of the conversation, and got another one of those like spikes after the George Floyd protests, are unions. Police unions and public unions generally, because they hold a monopoly on the public service, make it extremely difficult to sanction their employees after viable allegations of misconduct are alleged. I think certain cities are trying to be better about that, but I mean, the unions, especially public unions, teachers unions, I'm not just saying this is just police, they're very politically powerful. So a lot of people don't want to run afoul of them. And they are just able to kind of maintain a stranglehold on making sure, like, on instituting any sorts of, I think pretty common sense measures that would hold people accountable. I also think you mentioned something kind of off the cuff earlier. I think it is very troubling that when a police officer is fired, they can just like hop over to the neighboring county and like no one seems to care. That like, because like these allegations it takes a lot for a police officer to get fired for the first place. So if you got fired, you really done screwed up. And that, like, if you're in maybe let's say the Dallas Police Department, I don't know what the actual rules are here, so I don't want to be spreading fake news. But like, let's say, I mean, this happens many places across the country. If you're, hypothetically in Dallas, DFW is a huge area. So like, you go to Arlington, go to Denton County. Like, the idea that you can just go a few miles away, it just strikes me as very odd, and that there should be. And I think people on the right and the left could support some common sense, restrictions on things like that. And then people have also talked about, for these damage settlements, when they are awarded, coming out of an insurance market, so that if all police officers, like doctors, for instance, have to be insured. If a police officer is constantly like plagued by their insurance premium exploding because they have these damages coming out against them, then a department would theoretically be incentivized to terminate them.
That's true.
And then hopefully you wouldn't be able to just pop on over to the next county. So I think it's complex. I don't think that there is a silver bullet. I don't think there's really a silver bullet for any policy problem in this country. But it does seem very overwhelming. But I do think maybe in the future, as we continue to talk about stuff like this, hopefully some of the big picture things can come together, because it is really important, whether you're on the left, right, or whatever. I know everything is very polarized. All of our political conversations in this country are very polarized, but but there really should be nothing partisan, whether you are someone who is the thin blue line. I feel like a lot of people who dislike me the most paint me as this like anti-police person. I really am not. I've pushed back on the abolish the police thing, which I think is psychotic and silly. I certainly think that like violent crime should be prosecuted. Like, I'm not someone who's like pushing for anarchy. I just believe that if we
we'll get you on board at some point.
I believe, I'm like maybe minarchy, but I don't know if I could ever be anarchy. But all that to say, I believe that in a civil society, I think it makes sense to have someone upholding law and order. But I think it is very strange that we hold the most powerful people to the lowest standard. And I just think that's incredibly perverse. And I think it hurts the many men and women who do a great job, because
it does.
Who would want to be surrounded by people like that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing is, if you really are back the blue, then you should want to come down very hard on the ones who are
I totally agree.
because those guys make it harder for the ones who aren't abusing people.
Makes it all just look like a big circus, and looks like it's part of the reason. And it's one of the reasons why, speaking more on the people on the right who just kind of like reflexively defend whatever police do, it's always the media's fault. It's always, and we've talked about the media in this, like the media is culpable in bungling many things in this country, but that ignores like a rich and deep history of government abusing power. And I think it's very lazy on either side to say, oh, it's all this or all that. No, it's complicated. And I really do believe, as polarizing as this topic has become, that like the stuff I write about is extremely common sense. And I really do feel like I try to talk to everyone in that way. So
awesome.
My view.
Well, yeah, good. I mean, I really appreciate you coming on. We got to do this again because there's like so much more that we could be talking about. And unfortunately, there will probably be more stories that come up that we both end up covering. But before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find your work?
So I'm at reason.com. We have a monthly print magazine, and then I'm, do some of our online coverage as well. And then I'm on Twitter at Billy Binion, which is a hard name to forget. or X or whatever it is now.
Yes. And again, that's his real name. But thanks for coming by, Billy. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Until next time.